All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. The webinar is being put on by the Sexual Violence Justice Institute at the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault through funding from the Office of Violence Against Women and the U.S. Department of Justice. Our topic for today is 2 protocols, 1 survivor, building partnerships with colleges and universities to improve response to sexual violence on campus. Our presenter today is Dr. Roberta Gibbons from Metropolitan State University here in the Twin Cities area. Dr. Gibbons is part of the Department of Human Services at Metro State and directs the Violence Prevention and Intervention Concentration. Prior to becoming full-time faculty at Metro State, Dr. Gibbons was a community faculty member and worked as Associate Director of a campus-based violence prevention and intervention center called the Aurora Center on the University of Minnesota campus. I'm going to go ahead and pass things over to Dr. Gibbons now for our presentation.
Great, thank you, Malia. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Roberta Gibbons, and as Malia said, I currently work as a professor running a violence prevention and intervention major, but really established my interest in this area working at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities, where I ran a program there called the Aurora Center that serves survivors of sexual violence, domestic violence, and stalking. And so some of what I say today, most of what I say today will be based on policy and law, but some of the things I say today will just be based on my experience in working at that program and working on a campus for 12 years. As I understand it, most people out there and on this webinar are not a part of a campus, although some of you are. And I know that if you are not in the campus environment working as a part, working in sexual assault response as a part of a campus employee, the university response can just seem like such a strange beast that is very hard to understand. And I'm hoping to address some of that today and to hopefully answer some of the questions you might have. And if you have any particular questions as we go along, please, as Malia said, I encourage you to ask them via chat, and I'll do my best to answer them or provide you with resources to answer them. The slide you see in front of you lists the webinar goals, and the first goal really is related to specific challenges for survivors of sexual assault if they are college students. I'm sure that a large majority of you are aware of the challenges and the consequences of being a survivor of sexual violence for anyone, the confusion, the fear, the self-blame, and that, of course, those things exist for survivors of sexual assault on a college campus. But there are other challenges that survivors face, and we're going to talk about those. And they're just challenges that are related to survivors because of their status as a student on a college campus. The second thing we want to do today is to talk about several of the federal requirements for college campuses related to the sexual assault response. There are a number of laws that colleges have to abide by. Some of these laws actually are a little bit in conflict with each other in terms of what campuses are supposed to do, but hopefully I can explain the laws in an understandable way, and that will help you folks when you're thinking about partnering. Campuses do have concerns about community collaboration. Perhaps some of you have run into some of those concerns, and there's sort of roadblocks to collaboration, and I'd like to talk about those. And then I'd like to identify and perhaps invite you to share via chat areas of collaboration that have been successful. And finally, I just have a few suggestions about how to approach a campus if you haven't done that in your team's response area. All right, so let's start with as I said, the dynamics of sexual assault on a college campus. As I said before, campus really is, the response is a strange beast, and As we all know, the rate of reporting of sexual violence is very low in our communities, right? If you look at the research from the National Institute of Justice or anywhere else, we see anywhere between, about 20% of people making reports of sexual violence is usually where the number lands, around that 20%. But the information that we have for college campuses actually shows that number of people who report a sexual assault is actually down between 2 and 3% of those who experience it. So it is a much lower rate than even that incredibly low rate in our population in general. And the list that you see in front of you really helps to explain why this rate is so low. As I said, I worked with survivors of sexual assault on campus for 12 years, and the list you see in front of you is not from research, but from my own experience as an advocate and the director of a sexual violence program where we work with, when I started it was about 200 survivors a year. By the time I ended it was about 400. And this is on a campus of 50,000 students. So we know that that's really the tip of the iceberg, but still pretty high numbers when you look at campus programs. So as I said, the dynamics that you see in front of you are also reasons why many survivors don't wish to report. And the first four that you see, the shared activities, the shared residence halls, we used to call them dorms in my day, or shared classrooms that they might share with their perpetrator, these can really make it difficult for a survivor to identify herself or himself as a victim or to call what happened to them rape. When you see the person who hurt you every day because of the fact that they live down the hall from you, or they're in the lunchroom with you, or you're in a play with them, or they're your dance partner, it really puts additional social pressure on you to not want to call what happened to you sexual violence. And so we see the numbers of people identifying themselves as victims, even when we look at surveys that use behavioral questions, that number is really, really low. So all of these things make it less likely for someone to identify as a survivor of sexual assault, and then it makes them much less likely to come forward. They don't want to split their social group. Usually friends are forced to choose sides when an accusation like this is made. All of that being said, the final three things you see in front of you, not wanting to be punished for drinking, concern for their, and I have friend in quotation marks because overwhelmingly these are assaults by somebody known to the survivor, even more so than in the general public. And then finally not wanting parents to find out. These are the reasons that I have been told time and time and time again, and if there are any campus advocates on the phone, you can concur or disagree with me, but I have had more people say to me and to my advocate team that the main reason they don't go forward and make a report is because they don't want their parents to find out. That is, I would say, the number one reason. And the second one, worried about ruining the life of the person that hurt them. Without really quite knowing how what happened to them might have an effect on their life for lifelong. So again, this list is really a list of things that I think are pretty specific to what's going on in a college campus, and these are all in addition to the sort of known and expected consequences and challenges that sexual assault victims face no matter where their assault occurs. So in terms of federal guidelines, we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at these four pieces of, well, they're not all pieces of legislation, but all of these federal policies. They are the Clery Act, the Sexual Assault Victims Bill of Rights, Title IX in the Dear Colleague Letter, and then the Campus SAVE Act, the Sexual Violence Elimination Act, which is a part of the most recently codified VAWA Act that was signed into law by President Obama in late February, I believe. And so these are the ones that I want to talk about today. I do want to say that for anybody from a campus, and you might notice that there's something missing, and that is something called FERPA. And FERPA is the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act. That act has some overlap with sexual violence. However, it is generally accepted that Title IX trumps FERPA, and therefore anything that I tell you today should stand up to any FERPA challenges that you may see at your institutions. And for those people who aren't from universities and the FERPA is just Greek, you can just ignore everything that I just said and not worry about it. But I did want to note that that piece of legislation and that policy will not be discussed in today's webinar. Okay, so the Clery Act itself was renamed the Clery Act many years ago. The original title for it was the Campus Safety and Security Act. And the Clery Act was really the first piece of national legislation that placed requirements on universities for things that they have to do, that they have to, in order to be in compliance with national standards. So the Clery Act was passed in 1990, and it requires that universities have to publish annual reports and show 3 years of annual reports which disclose their crime statistics for a variety of different crimes. They have to make warnings to the campus community if the campus determines that there is an ongoing threat. So not all crimes that have to be reported will be crimes about which a timely warning must be made. The campus does have some discretion in terms of whether or not there is a threat and whether or not they will put out a campus alert. They have to make their crime log public, and usually the way most universities are doing that now is by simply putting it on the internet of their safety office. And there are fines that can be levied against universities if they do not comply or if they are found to have, for example, reported much lower numbers than those that really exist. There have been a lot of questions about Clery and the fact that if you do look at a university's crime logs and you look at the sexual assaults at a university, often the number of sexual assaults that is reported is significantly, and I use that term as strongly as possible, it's significantly lower than what is happening and even what is reported to an advocacy organization. So I can give you an example. At the University of Minnesota, in the years that I was there, our Clery numbers, which I believe were accurate, showed between 2 and 10 sexual assaults a year. However, I already told you that we served 300 to 400 survivors a year. How can this be so? Well, Clery requires reports of crimes that happen on campus or in the language is unobstructed areas adjacent to campus, and then in the last few years has required reporting of crimes that happened in Greek housing, which was not a part of Clery for its first 2 decades in existence. And so because most of these assaults happen in the victim's home or in the perpetrator's home, and most people do not live on campus, anybody who was assaulted off of campus was not counted in Clery numbers. So the geographical limits of Clery are a big reason why the numbers are often so low. And there have also been changes in Clery over the last 2 decades related to whether or not you had to report something that happened if somebody came to you in January and it happened in November of the year previous, for example. So it is true that campuses have an interest in keeping those numbers low, and it is true that some campuses have artificially deflated their Clery numbers, but it's also very true that those numbers are never, ever going to be anywhere near an accurate representation of the sexual violence that happens to students on the campus. All right. The Sexual Assault Victims Bill of Rights is also something that was a part of the Campus Safety and Security Act. And this is really, I would say that the Sexual Assault Victims Bill of Rights is something that is not known to many people on campuses or certainly off campuses. And it is not something that has been, that campuses have paid very close attention to because there really hasn't been any mechanism for enforcement of this so-called Bill of Rights. But it does require that both the accuser and the accused have to have the equal opportunity to have a support person present in any type of questioning or hearing related to sexual assault. It also requires that both the victim and the alleged perpetrator should be given in writing the results of any campus investigation, the findings as they're called on campus. It also requires that survivors be notified of many things, including counseling services, their option to notify law enforcement, and their option to change their academic and living situations if they wish. At the University of Minnesota, we had an agreement with our housing office that if we did have a victim who needed to be moved immediately, that person would have access to any empty residence hall room that was there. And because it was such a large campus, there was always an empty residence hall room somewhere. So moving people was not an issue if they wanted to be moved for the campus that I worked at, but certainly at smaller campuses I could see how that could be a problem. But if the option exists, survivors have to be notified of it. And let me also say before I go on that the Campus SAVE Act, which I'll be talking about last, and which was recently signed into law and is apparently going to have some teeth behind it, is really, more than anything else, an amalgamation of the Clery Act, the Sexual Assault Victims Bill of Rights, and Title IX as it has been explained through the Dear Colleague letter. So when we get to the Campus SAVE Act, it's sort of, a comprehensive representation of everything else that I'm going to talk to before we get there. Okay, so Title IX and DCL, which stands for Dear Colleague letter. Most people, when they think of Title IX, think about sports. Title IX guarantees equal access to education and all the activities related to education, and says you can't discriminate against someone based on their sex in any education programs and activities. And Title IX applies to K through 12 as well as higher education, and for a long time has been used to guarantee equal access to athletic activities that are a part of at a university, and also K through 12. However, because Title IX is really an anti-discrimination law, anything that gets in the way, that creates a barrier to education for someone based on their sex, is something that could be considered cause under Title IX, and universities and any other educational institutions have to be prepared to deal with complaints that are related to that. So in terms of sexual violence then, how do we fit Title IX into there? Well, it has been determined through numerous court cases over the last 2 decades that sexual violence is considered egregious sexual harassment. And sexual harassment is a form of discrimination that is prohibited by Title IX. And so thus we come to this sort of strange place where Title IX, which is allowing young girls and young women to play soccer and lacrosse and everything else on their respective campuses, is also the same policy that is being used to protect individuals or to require universities to respond adequately to individuals who are survivors of sexual violence. So Title IX has a number of requirements that schools have to fulfill. They have to have a notice of non-discrimination, and they have to disseminate it. Dissemination can mean a letter to all students. It can mean posting it on your website. Every school has to have a Title IX coordinator. So for those people who are interested in working with campuses and you're not sure where to start, figuring out who the Title IX coordinator on the campus is a great starting place. Finally, Title IX requires that universities publish grievance procedures and also provide prompt and equitable resolution to any complaints that are filed. And those terms, prompt and equitable, have been nuanced and have been changing since the first court case. It keeps changing here and there. But with the Dear Colleague letter, we have learned that what is generally expected is that any complaint of sexual violence to a campus official, that the campus should come to a conclusion and reach a finding within about 60 days, 60 business days. And so we'll talk more about that requirement in a minute. Okay. And again, I've titled all of these slides Title IX, but I want to be really clear that the Dear Colleague letter simply provided guidance for schools regarding what they should do in terms of Title IX. It was nothing new. It didn't have any new requirements. It simply was clarifying and providing guidance to universities. So anything you see on these slides under Title IX is also true under that Dear Colleague letter that was released by the Office for Civil Rights about 1.5 years ago. I will say that the Dear Colleague letter has certainly lit a fire under many campuses across our great nation to really get moving on all this. So in terms of prompt and equitable, universities can meet this requirement by providing very clear notice to students and employees about what their rights are and about what the procedures are on the campus. All campuses, when they get notice of this type of crime, and I'm just going to use the word when a report is made, although I know that what a report is can create questions, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, but for now let's talk about like an official report to somebody who can do something about it. When that type of report is made, universities must investigate. They have to investigate on their own. They must conduct their own investigation. They can work in concert with a criminal justice process, but they certainly can't just leave it up to the police, and they certainly can't say, well, instead of us doing an investigation, let's just have this victim report to the police. None of those are acceptable. Federal law absolutely requires that an investigation be done on the campus by the authority of that campus, whoever has been designated, usually a Title IX coordinator, sometimes a director of student judicial affairs. A university has to designate reasonably prompt time frames for the stages of the complaint process, including the appeal. And then they have to communicate the outcome to all parties involved. And again, you will recognize that this is similar to Clery and the Sexual Assault Bill of Rights, which said that both parties have access to the outcome of any complaint process. And a lot of universities had not been doing this before the Dear Colleague letter came out. They were only giving the accused person or the respondent information about the outcome and not giving it to the victim. And while we are on this, I will also say that in the last 2 years that it's been made very clear that universities cannot place any type of gag order on the person, on the complainant or the victim, requiring that they not talk about the outcome of any complaint process. Victims may talk about the outcome, if they wish to, with whomever they wish. Okay, we're trying to get to the next slide. There we go. So Title IX does create a number of obligations. As I said, universities do have to investigate, and an investigation should, and I'll talk more about this later as well, the investigation should only go forward in large amount if the victim agrees. So universities, through the Dear Colleague letter, was very clear that, that universities should give as much weight as possible to the choices of the victim, that the victim should be able to stop an investigation whenever he or she wishes to, but that power is not complete. It's sometimes the university has to continue an investigation if they believe that there is a threat to the safety of other people on campus, or if they have other information, if a complaint has been made against the same person more than one time, for example. Universities also will have other pressure if a case goes public. Even, because the news gets a hold of it for one reason or another, say a criminal complaint was filed and it's against a star athlete or something like that, which I certainly saw in my time many times. At that point, the university is probably not going to stop any type of investigation. They also need to take steps to end the sexual violence and try to prevent it occurring again, and to address its effects. So what this essentially means is that they need to say, okay, where did this happen? Did this happen at a fraternity? If it did, even if the survivor doesn't want to go forward with an investigation, we need to have some sort of training at that fraternity. And then they still need to offer the appropriate counseling referrals, housing accommodations, etc., to the survivor, even if they don't want to take the survivor doesn't want to take the next step. And then they need to protect the complainant, which means essentially to have a strong non-retaliation policy and to back it up with action if there is some sort of retaliation for the report by either the respondent, that is the alleged perpetrator, or by any of the friends of said perpetrator. Okay, so Title IX is also very clear that an assault does not have to happen on the campus proper in order for a complaint to be filed. This is different than the Clery Act. The Clery Act, as you recall, only counts crimes that occur on the campus proper, for the most part. However, Title IX extends its jurisdiction to any if something happens and the university has the ability to hold the perpetrator accountable or protect the survivor, then the university has to do something about it. Title IX reiterates that mediation is not appropriate as a way to address an incident of sexual assault. And this is one of the sticking points, I believe, is that schools should not wait, and this Campus Save Act makes it clear that they cannot wait for a criminal proceeding to conclude before the university conducts its own investigation. And I know that this becomes very, very complicating for response teams working with campuses when both a criminal complaint is made and a complaint is made on the college campus, because there's sometimes a feeling that, you know, campus authorities or a Title IX investigator are going to mess with chain of evidence, or, you know, or bias witnesses or what have you, and just sort of get in the way of that criminal investigation. But this is, again, one of those laws that the university, if it doesn't follow them, the university then can be sued because it didn't follow that law, either by the accused perpetrator or the victim. Now, the Dear Colleague letter is we generally understand that there can be a break of about a week. You know, the guidance said 3 to 10 days, where there can be a break to allow some criminal investigation and process to move forward. But anyone in the criminal justice community knows 3 to 10 days is not a whole lot of time when you're investigating a sexual assault. Finally, and I have an asterisk next to this one, the Dear Colleague letter made it very clear that schools must use a preponderance of evidence standard, right, which is a standard of evidence that essentially means more likely than not, or 51% of the evidence. And this is the standard of evidence that is used in civil trials, civil cases, and this adjudication process at a university is really supposed to look a lot more like a civil process than a criminal process. We also need to remember that the most that a university can do is expel a student. They can't put them in jail. They cannot fine them. And so the standard of evidence is lower, also in part because the consequences of a finding of responsible, which is the word that universities use rather than guilty. You are responsible for the behavior. So a finding of the worst, a finding of responsible at most can get you expelled from the school, and that rarely happens, even with a finding of sexual assault. The reason I have an asterisk next to this one is because even though Title IX and Dear Colleague have made it very clear that preponderance of evidence should be used, this language was taken out of the Campus Save Act, and which has left it open for schools to use a clear and convincing standard of evidence, which is not as much as beyond a reasonable doubt, but is certainly much higher than the preponderance standard. And this has really been a point of contention throughout the U.S. in terms of some advocates feeling like, this was a big loss that this didn't get codified by the Campus Save Act. It certainly doesn't encourage schools at all to use clear and convincing, but some schools that are using that are now able to continue to use that standard of evidence. Sorry for the slide delay. All right. So again, there are requirements. Title IX requires that people who are involved in a grievance procedure regarding sexual assault, they have to have some training. And certainly if the campus does not have its own sexual assault program, a community advocacy program is probably going to be the best body and have the most knowledge in terms of being able to offer that training. And again, both parties have to be notified in writing. I've talked about that. Schools should obtain consent from the victim before conducting an investigation, but they do not have to. It is not a requirement, but something needs to be kept in mind here, and that is that the primary way a school is going to find out about a sexual assault is because a victim came forward and told them. And usually if a victim or survivor of sexual assault makes a report, it's because they want something done by the school. I've talked to a lot of advocates, and there really is sort of a real tension here because we want our survivors to have complete control over what happens to their cases, even if they're going through a university process and not a criminal process. But at the same time, we want our schools to be held accountable for getting something done when a survivor does make a report. And so luckily, where most schools are located, there is either a community program that offers confidential resources that a survivor can get help from if they don't want to make an official report, or there's an on-campus program. It's still true that the overwhelming majority of schools do not have on-campus programs, but they would have a counseling office, and they would have a Title IX coordinator. However, that tension between giving the victim agency and control over what happens to the case and holding schools accountable is a tension that we're still, I believe, working out. I also want to let people know that the Dear Colleague letter was issued just a few months after a pretty scathing report was released by the Center for Public Integrity. The Center for Public Integrity, and you can find this report online if you go to the Center for Public Integrity, did over a year-long investigation and released a report that showed that there were a number of schools who were covering up sexual assaults, discouraging victims from coming forward, etc. And all of this action that has happened in the last year and a half, it could just be coincidence, but it's all been after there was a report of schools doing nothing. And so now there's been a really big push by the federal government to say, schools, you have to do something. And we're going to have to work really hard to make sure that our victims don't get lost in that process. The next slide somewhat reiterates what I said, and that is that schools need to try their best to honor the wishes of the victim when deciding what type of investigation to do, and that they need to work really hard to try to balance confidentiality and privacy with the need to protect the community. Okay, so we're going to move on to the Campus SAVE Act. Again, SAVE stands for Sexual Violence Elimination, and as I said, it was part of the most recent VAWA Act that Obama just signed. What I'm going to discuss and what you see in front of you regarding SAVE essentially is scheduled to go into effect 1 year from the signing. So that would be in February or March of 2014. But in terms of campus reporting, it would then affect their October is when Clery reporting is due. So the crime statistics that campuses have to report on and publish are due in October. And so October 2014 is probably when we'll see much of this go into effect regarding reporting. There are a lot of questions that remain related to the Campus SAVE Act, what kind of guidance is going to be issued, how we're going to define certain terms, and so we're still waiting for some of that. But for now, here's what we know. It does reiterate a lot of Clery in the Victims' Bill of Rights. The annual security report is the name of the report that campuses have to do every year that discloses the number of crime reports that happened on campus. And it expands the types of crimes that have to be reported. It includes domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking now, and it never included those before. And it also requires, and this is huge, it requires prevention education for all incoming students and staff. And in the Campus SAVE Act, it is specific and says that campuses have to do bystander education and risk reduction education. This is something that many campuses already do, but again, a lot of campuses do not do, and certainly not for all incoming students. How long such prevention education? Can it be 15 minutes? Can it be online? Does it have to be 3 days long? We do not know the answers to these questions. But I'm going to suggest that this is one prime place for collaboration between community agencies and the campus, because a lot of our community agencies have a lot of good information that would be a good addition to any trainings that are done. Another big improvement that Campus SAVE requires is that anyone involved in the response procedure not only has to have training, but they have to have training every year. And this is a very big change because, as you can imagine, there are people who are involved and they go through training once, and then 25 years later they're still doing their same job and they haven't learned anything new or kept up. So this will be a big change. And I'm going to talk at the end about, well, who are these people who are involved in the investigation and what exactly do campuses do? But for now, I'll just say that what they do and whoever's involved, that annual training is required. And then the requirement is for written notice now to be made to victims regarding the procedures that will be followed, their rights, and the possible sanctions for their alleged perpetrator. So the next few slides really sort of give you information on what the policy that the campus has regarding sexual violence, what the policy has to have stated in it. And for those who might be interested in working with campuses on response, this policy should be posted on their campus safety website someplace. You should be able to find what their policy is. You could do a search for annual security report, and that report should include the policy or a link to it. And so the next few slides really share with you the additional things that campuses have to have in their policy based on the SAVE Act. And so this first thing is that it has to include both the sanctions and the protective measures that the institution might impose if there's a finding of any of these types of what we might call violence against women on their campus. So they have to be very clear about what they're going to do and also what type of remedies there may be. So if a report of one of these types of crimes is made, their policy also has to be really clear about, and this will sound good to anyone in the criminal justice community, the importance of preserving evidence and how to obtain any type of protective order. So again, I mean, it's great to have this information in a policy, but the real question will be, how are we going to get this information to the students? It needs to be made clear to whom such an incident should be reported if people do want some sort of official response. And it needs to let people know that they will receive help in making a report to the police if they want to make a report, but that they do not have to. And it should also be made very clear that survivors can receive help on campus from a counseling office or an advocacy program, but they do not have to make a report to campus authorities if they don't want to. Campuses are going to want to be really, really careful to make sure that they don't look like they're discouraging reports, while at the same time making it really clear that they don't have to make a report. This is a sort of a reiteration of things that we saw in the Clery Act and the Victims' Bill of Rights, that survivors need to be made aware of resources, both on campus and in the community. So another place that's a very good place for collaboration. The statements also need to be clear about what the victim's rights are and what the institution will do regarding no contact orders, restraining orders, etc. And I can say that, you know, this is an area, again, another area where it's been very difficult for campuses and for local courts to figure out exactly what's going on. I certainly found in the counties, the University of Minnesota is located in 2 counties, and the counties in which that I worked, that the judges were really reticent to be writing restraining orders for survivors who ordered their perpetrator out of a classroom or out of a residence hall. They really saw this as a matter that should be left up to the university process. But of course, the university process, you know, at best is taking 60 business days, which is about 3/4 of a semester. So really trying to flesh out how to best handle this is going to be a continued challenge, I think. But we do know that universities have to come up with a policy and figure out how they are going to handle restraining orders or no contact orders, whether they're civil, criminal, or tribal. Victims need to know in writing what kind of accommodations can be made at their request. Again, they need to be reasonably available, and these should be made available regardless of whether or not a victim chooses to report it to the campus authorities or to the criminal justice authorities. I can certainly say that this idea of academic accommodation is related to the type of advocacy that the Aurora Center provides. I don't know what else to call it, but the most popular, most well-utilized type of advocacy. We had a lot of survivors in the middle of midterms or in the middle of finals who would be having a really hard time, and we would contact professors on their behalf, let them know they were working with our office and ask for an extension or a retake or an alternate test-taking environment so they don't have to be sitting next to their perpetrator, etc. And, you know, 99% of the time, professors were very accommodating. They didn't like getting letters or emails with Aurora Center letterhead, and were generally happy to do whatever we asked. And so some schools do it that way, and other schools will have you go to a dean or an assistant vice president or something like that who can just, order a professor to do it, and that actually is the next step if a professor were to say no at a request. But this idea of academic advocacy is something that campuses with programs will do, and it's something that's very, very helpful to survivors because getting through the semester and staying in school is really important to a large majority of them. Schools need to be very clear about how they are going to protect the confidentiality of survivors. They need to be clear with the survivors about the difference between confidentiality and privacy. And they need to be clear about how they're going to keep records, for example, for Clery, without disclosing any identifying information. When I worked with people collecting numbers for the Clery Act, we would never include any names. I don't know how else to put it. They wouldn't even be included in the report, the sort of confidential report that nobody saw. Everything was based on dates, locations, times, and characteristics of an assault to make sure that we were not double counting. But the Campus Save Act just requires that universities be very clear about how they're going to work that out, how they're going to make sure that confidentiality is extended to survivors even if the report is counted. So again, SAVE, much like we saw under Title IX, says that that victims, if they report any of these types of crimes, whether they occurred on or off campus, need to be given something in writing that tells them what their rights are and what their options are on that campus. Okay, so in summary then, the Campus Save Act does codify a lot of that Dear Colleague letter as it provided guidance for Title IX, but not all of it. And most notably is the standard of evidence that I talked about. And there are some other small details that I will not go into on this webinar. It also reiterates a lot of Clery and the Student Right to Know Victims' Rights Act. It expands hate crime categories, as I said, to include domestic violence, stalking, and dating violence. One of its, strongest provisions is that it does require that prevention programming. It also has language in it that says that universities have to carry out sexual violence prevention campaigns. Nobody knows what that means. And we're all waiting to find out. It requires that annual training for those involved in the response or adjudication, and then has all those very detailed requirements, which were the last few slides that we looked at, that tells the university exactly what its campus policy has to include and what it has to include in writing to the campus community, which has to be disseminated widely, and also to survivors who come forward. As I said, it leaves some questions unanswered. A lot of them have to do with defining things, so defining dating violence, defining stalking, defining the campaign, etc. So there are still some things we're waiting for guidance on. I'm going to switch directions just a little bit and talk about a standard protocol and response on a college campus. Now, campuses are going to approach this in different ways, but knowing what we know about requirements under Title IX, and I won't talk, and Campus Save codified a lot of those, but according to those requirements, the information I'm giving you now, I think, is pretty standard across all campuses, although there are some alternative ways campuses can handle some things. the first thing I want to tell you is not on the slide, and that is that, well, no, I think it's on my next slide, so I'm going to just talk about here. I mentioned that a report to campus officials will trigger an investigation. Now, maybe some of you have heard of Brett Sokolow or heard him speak. He does a lot of training on these issues and is a lawyer and will come to your campus if you have money. But he talks about the difference between a small I and a capital I investigation. And I would concur. I think this is a good way to think about it. That the Dear Colleague letter makes it very clear that a university needs to do something when it gets a report. If a report is made to a person who's an advisor for a student group, and a student happens to mention in a conversation that something happened to them, that is a lot different than a student marching into the vice president's office and saying, this happened to me last weekend and I want you to do something about it. And so the former case where a student is mentioning in passing that they thought something might have happened to them the weekend before but they couldn't really remember and they start crying to their advisor, we want campuses to respond differently to that than they do to someone marching into the Dean of Students' office. And Title IX allows for that. And so this idea of a small I investigation would be related to that first case, where they do tell someone who's not confidential. Advisors are not confidential. They trigger what's called actual notice at a university. They have some responsibility for and some authority for student activities. And so therefore, that if they know, according to the law, that means the university knows. So like if the case went to court, they'd say, who knew? The judge would say, who knew? And someone would say, the advisor knew. And then the judge would say, okay, that means the university knew. Right? That's very different than someone going to an advocate, right, who is confidential, or a counselor, or a doctor. But if an advisor knows, then the university knows. But they're kind of this second tier. They're in this weird place where they're not confidential, but they're not a vice president or a dean. And so in those cases, the university really is able to say to the, to the survivor, well, I'm worried about you, and let's get you these services, and here's everything we have available for you, and we're going to need to look into this a little bit. And then the university, define what a little bit is. I know that's a hard question, but the university should do a little bit of digging at that time to try to figure out if there's a public safety risk. Has the person who this person is complaining about been reported before? Was there a, is it a classic, MO? Was the person isolated? Do we think this person's going to do it again? And all of this while trying to protect confidentiality, et cetera. And if they find out this was a former boyfriend and he's never been reported before, and, et cetera, and the survivor really doesn't want anything to go forward, she really just wants some help, then the university can ask the survivor to, for example, sign something that says, I understand I have the right to a hearing, I understand the university can investigate, but I don't want that. And then it can stop. But if somebody walks into the Dean of Students' office or a Vice President's office and says, I want something done, then the university has to undertake that much larger investigation, talk to the alleged perpetrator, do what they do to investigate, talk to people who are at the party. It looks much like a criminal justice investigation, and then come to some findings. And how they come to those findings has two possible ways, and they're on the next slide. So I've covered those first 2 bullet points. I hope I've made it clear that schools have to offer services even if there's not an official report, and that the type of investigation, there's kind of 2 types that I just described, may be very influenced by the victim's wishes. And again, the school can't wait till the end of a criminal justice did that go? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So adjudication on campus, a Title IX coordinator is likely to be the person who investigates. However, sometimes on a college campus it will be a director of student judicial affairs. And some campuses who have on-campus police departments might say, you know what, we're just going to have our police department investigate and then turn that information over to our Title IX coordinator or turn it over to our director of student judicial affairs. As I said before, there will be a finding of responsible or not responsible. That's in place of guilty or not guilty. Generally, there are no lawyers involved. If the accused student retains a lawyer, which they have a right to do, then the university, most universities will have someone from their general counsel's office act as the lawyer in any type of hearing that might go forward. Now, some campuses use the Title IX process to investigate and come up with a finding, which generally means that the Title IX coordinator, on his or her own, or perhaps with a team of 2 or 3 or 4 people, will gather the evidence, read the evidence, and come up with a finding. And then some campuses use a hearing board model where the Title IX coordinator or the director of student judicial affairs will do all the evidence gathering and investigation, and then that information is presented to a hearing board, which often includes faculty, staff, and students. And then that hearing board will have a vote and make a determination of whether or not someone should be held responsible for what they're being accused of. Much like the criminal justice process, if the general counsel is there, or even if it's just a presenter, which is what universities call the people who present the cases, boy, I lost my train of thought, but the presenter will be the one who they'll go before, and that there are generally no lawyers involved. And as I said before, the highest sanction possible for a finding is expulsion. However, it's much more likely for a student who is found responsible for sexual violence to be asked to leave a university until the survivor graduates, or for a year, or to not sign up for any classes that the survivor signs up for, to maybe move their schedule around rather than asking the survivor to move theirs, and maybe some community service and some counseling or something. But expulsion remains a very rare type of response or result of these types of hearings. So I think sometimes people have the understanding that this is, double jeopardy, that if somebody makes a criminal report and a report to their university, that then the accused perpetrator is, isn't this double jeopardy? And it's not. They're not being tried for the same crime twice. The university process is totally separate from criminal justice. And again, there are many federal laws that require the university to pursue protection of their students outside of or concurrent with any criminal justice approach. There are a lot of things that are against university rules that go through a student affairs adjudication process that would never be considered against the law. So like cheating and having a waterbed in your residence hall, burning incense in campus housing. So these are all different types of things that might go through the student adjudication process that would never end up in the criminal justice process. You know, a lot of people believe that investigations need to be left up to the police, something we could all debate for a long time. And this is related to the idea that what kind of training do these Title IX coordinators have that are doing this investigation? And I will tell you that there is not really a standard, but campuses are responsible for doing thorough and accurate investigations. And so, you know, most campuses are going to have their Title IX coordinators trained in these issues in terms of doing an investigation, et cetera. Title IX coordinators often will have a lot of experience doing investigations into other types of matters, like sexual harassment matters, for example. And so they're certainly not novices, but we know that sexual assault investigation requires a lot of special skills, and whether or not all Title IX coordinators or student judicial affairs coordinators at every campus in our country have them is, you know, that's probably not real likely. There are a lot of reasons why a victim might choose to report to school officials but not the police. Certainly the standard of evidence being lower makes it more likely that there will be a finding of responsible and a consequence for the perpetrator if you go through the student judicial or Title IX process. It's also true that, as you know, a lot of victims want to protect their perpetrators in a sense. And a lot of them want him to leave them alone. They want him gone until they graduate, but they certainly don't want to see him put in jail. I talked about how often students are found responsible. Maybe I didn't, but I haven't seen research on this. We don't have any really good numbers in my experience. I would say 1/3 to 1/2 of the time, if something actually got to the point of a hearing, we would see students being found responsible for something. It might be providing alcohol to a minor if people don't want to make that sexual assault finding, but there was some sort of consequence, and I'd say 1/3 to 1/2 of the cases that I knew about in the 12 years that I worked at the university. So in terms of partnership, schools can definitely benefit by having, you know, a confidential community resource to serve their students. It would be a big, big benefit if schools knew that there were resources out there to do that response part and that providing counseling and advocacy, et cetera, and that they knew that they could refer their students to. I think schools in the coming future are going to need a lot of help with training for students, faculty and staff involved with adjudication. And it's probably true that, you know, our community responders can probably do their response better when they're working with college students if they know more about the university process. And so you folks all have your protocols, and you now have some understanding about what universities might have to do. And so on this slide, I'm just providing ideas for what needs to be kept in mind when we go forward and think about how are we going to get our protocols to line up together so that the survivor is best served. There are issues of timelines and confidentiality. We have different standards of evidence. How are we going to share? You know, will there be any sharing of evidence? What sort of communication will there be? But we certainly know that there's going to be a need for both jurisdictions to investigate. In the next few slides, I simply provide some language that I think might be helpful if you decide you want to go forward and you don't have a contact at a university that might fall into your jurisdiction, if you don't have a contact. So I make suggestions for beginning conversations with Title IX coordinators or campus advocates mostly focusing on, as you can see, working together, offering your services, being open and saying you need to learn more about what they do, because believe me, some campuses will be very wary of outside individuals wanting to come in and get involved with their sexual assault stuff, because for many years and continuing till today, campuses have had an interest in keeping all of this within their control. So again, suggestions for working with the counseling office. And suggestions for working with the Women's Center, student groups, or faculty in a number of different departments who might be open to these kinds of conversations. I certainly think that student groups they often have a lot of power for making requests. And if you can form a partnership or have a conversation with a student group and then they get interested and say, oh, we need to have a training on campus, for students about the community's response to sexual violence, or we need more students to know about this Campus Save Act so they know what their rights are, and the students ask for that, they have a good chance of getting it, even more than somebody from an advocacy organization on campus would. I certainly learned that. It took me too many years to learn it, but I finally learned it. How important it is to get students involved in your ask when you're on a college campus. So again, more ideas for talking to people about working together in order to best serve survivors, and in order to help folks in the community can also be of assistance and can build a relationship if you are able and willing to talk about and help with training and those sorts of things as well. So as I said before, and these might be really obvious, but campuses do have concerns about, if we start working with the community, is it more likely for our cases to go public, even if our survivors want to keep them confidential? Most of the stuff that happens on college campuses does not make the newspaper. When it does, there's a criminal report, and it's usually an athlete, to be perfectly honest, or somebody that that the newspapers think the public would have an interest in. Campuses are worried about losing control of a case, things sort of getting out of hand, and certainly the more people that can peer in, the more people involved, the more transparent they are, the more chance of them looking like they did something wrong. And that incompetence can then invite a lawsuit by the accused or by the victim, and that can lead to a loss of, for example, foundation support, or guess what else? Enrollment. Campuses really want to try to protect their reputation, so if you're thinking about how are we going to work with campuses, keep in mind that they're very concerned about protecting their own reputations. So I just have some ideas about what next if you do want to go forward and work with campus, work with some folks on campuses. Certainly having a meeting with your team to discuss, whether or not it looks like it makes sense to go forward and work with campuses and getting those protocols together. And certainly, here the internet is a great place to look. If you go to a campus safety website or search for the Campus Security Report or Annual Security Report, you should be able to gather information about what your campus is doing, even if you haven't had the opportunity to talk to anyone from that campus about what it is they're doing. And I will say that because if you find something online and it's in policy and in writing, that doesn't necessarily mean that's exactly what's happening. I gave suggestions for contacts on previous slides, and I encourage folks to make the call to advocates or student groups or Title IX coordinators to see if you might be able to work together to get protocols in line to best serve survivors.
Great. Well, thanks, Roberta. We'll move ahead here and take a look at some of the questions that have come in throughout the call and see if we can get some of them answered for you.
Okay, we have some questions about the Clery Act. There's a question about reports to student health centers. Folks that work in a health center should be confidential as they are for any other medical concern, and so they should not trigger actual notice or the university investigating. Someone asked about the accused being moved rather than the victim. Isn't that the case? The accused can be moved if there is a finding, for sure. Can the accused be moved if an accusation is made? You can ask the accused to be moved, but if the accused has a lawyer, the lawyer will tell them not to move. The lawyer, because moving looks like an admission in some people's eyes, and so if the university has in its policy, if you are accused of sexual assault and the person making the complaint lives in your residence hall, you will be moved, then that move can, yes, the person who's accused can be moved if that's part of the policy. If it's not, then it's hard, then it's just an ask. It's just a request. A lot of times, from my experience, victims are happy to be moved. Sometimes they don't want to be because they want to try to just normalize things and just get back to their regular life. But sometimes just providing that option to victims, that's what the requirement is through Clery and through the Campus Save Act, that you offer the option to survivors to be moved if it's a reasonable request. There's a question about a Christian college that places the victim and offender under their version of a protective order which has no legal standing. Is that legal? Both parties are required to abide by it. Lindsay, I'm not a lawyer, and campuses can have policies that are more restrictive than criminal law, but they can't have policies that are less restrictive, if that makes sense. So, for example, they can define consent more strictly than our criminal law does, but they can't define it less strictly. And so I don't know what this protective order looks like. I'd be happy to have a conversation with you off at another time about this. So I think I need to kind of let that one go. Can a victim be placed under gag order during the investigation is another question. So if there's a Title IX investigation going on, can a university ask a victim not to talk while that is going on? That is a good question that I do not know the answer to, Lindsay, but I'm going to mark the ones that I don't know the answer to, and I will find out the answer and ask MNCASA to share those with the whole group. Title IX refers to education programs receiving federal financial assistance. Does this mean private colleges are exempt from this? A lot of times private colleges do receive federal financial assistance as well, but if there is no federal financial assistance, then I'm quite sure that Title IX would not apply, but that's another one I'm going to double check for you. What does OCR stand for? It's the Office for Civil Rights. The Office for Civil Rights. And the slide says victim agency. Those were not supposed to be related. So OCR is Office for Civil Rights. That is the body that released the Dear Colleague letter. There's a question about the content of prevention programs, and again, that's something that we don't know about from SAVE and what that content is going to include in terms of separating men and women. And Certainly, there's a question about what best practices are, and that could be another webinar. Maybe we'll talk about that, about what has been shown to be effective on college campuses in terms of prevention. But separating males and females is absolutely right now within the bounds of both, what we know from Title IX and Campus Save, as well as to some extent best practices, but it really depends on what the content is there. There's a question about community advocates. Are they allowed on campus for victim support? That is something that could be worked out, absolutely. Again, where I worked, we had our own advocates, but I do know of many campuses across the country who have community advocates come to campus for support and even hold regular office hours on campus. Campus Save is included in the VAWA Act. Do all campuses receive VAWA funds? Okay, so the question is, how does VAWA include responsibilities for campuses? It doesn't matter whether you receive Violence Against Women Act funds, the Campus Save Act will apply to you, regardless of whether you receive VAWA funds. There have been a lot of grants to campuses over the last 12 or 13 years from VAWA, but the Campus Save Act is separate from that. It's a completely separate. We do not know when guidance will be provided. Somebody asked that. We would expect, since this is supposed to go into effect February of 2014, that, hopefully it will be provided, before the fall, but we really do not know. Okay, so if the student is under age 18 and there's a mandated report against a minor, that all still holds. So all those laws about mandated reporting, a lot of our campuses have what are called PSEO students, post-secondary educational opportunity students. So they're high school students taking classes on the college campus. They're not 18. Nobody out there listening to this is going to be surprised that they are often targeted as victims. But it would be mandated reporting only as far as those reporting requirements go. So the assault of a 17-year-old by a 19-year-old does not trigger that mandated report unless, there's some sort of relationship of them being the coach or something like that. So it would be the standard mandated reporting requirements. We're getting close to the end. I have a couple more questions that I can answer if people want to stay on the line, but I don't know how you want to do this, Malia.
What I think I'll do in interest of time is just at this point thank everyone for joining us. I'll give a little plug here for an upcoming webinar, which will be taking place on Wednesday, June 26th, 2013, from noon to 1:30, and that's Without a Disclosure, One Community's Approach to Addressing Sex Trafficking of Minors. So stay tuned for information about that. If you're on our call today, we will make sure that you get information about that next webinar. So yes, thanks again to everyone for joining us today, and thanks to Roberta. I think since we just have a couple questions left, if you don't mind, Roberta, we can go ahead and get through those, but I wanted to make sure that if people do need to leave, they have all the information. Again, we're recording this, and so we will make sure that the recording is available to anyone who may be interested. Thanks to everyone, and again, please do fill out the evaluation at the end. We'll jump back in and just get a couple more questions, and then we'll officially wrap up.
Okay. So there's a couple of questions about student protocol and adjudication, and one of them asks, if a student doesn't want a whole investigation, but we have found a safety risk, what are your suggestions to go about the balance between victims' wishes and campus accountability? And this is from Lexi. it sounds like you're probably from a campus, and I will say that the answer to this is so case specific that it's a little bit difficult for me to answer, but I would say that you know, that moving along and keeping the victim as informed as possible and keeping his or her information as confidential as possible, you know, would be my suggestion. I think if you find a safety risk that you do need to go forward in terms of trying to hold the perpetrator accountable, but at the same time, you know, doing your very best to provide services and as much information as possible to the survivor. You know, this is one of those cases where, I mean, it breaks my heart, and I experience these myself, where a survivor comes forward and the train gets started, and they go from the advocacy organization to the Student Judicial Affairs office to the Title IX office because they want accountability, and then it's too much and they want it all to stop, and it's really hard to stop that moving train. If the university did stop and that perpetrator then assaulted someone else, that someone else could sue the university for millions and millions of dollars, and this has been done. And so it is hard, if there is found to be a safety risk, to completely honor the wishes of our survivors. The second question asks, do you find that the campus investigation, and that's in quotes, and or finding of responsible or not responsible, supplements or interferes with the criminal investigation? Are there negative consequences for the victim to go through the Title IX process? I would say that as we know, sometimes victims talk about the criminal justice system being a second rape, right? You guys have all probably read and heard that. And certainly we know that's happening less and less, where victims are feeling so hurt by a process. That can happen on a campus as well. Campuses are not all the same when it comes to the knowledge, the compassion, and frankly the personalities of the people who are involved in these processes. And there can be some negative consequences, but on the other hand, there can be some very, very positive consequences. The survivor feels like she took a stand, there were, something was done, she was listened to, the university took it seriously, the perpetrator has been asked to leave until the victim graduates, etc. So if it's done well, it can have a very, very good outcome. Now, whether or not it interferes with the criminal justice process, I think my colleagues in the criminal justice system will say sometimes it sure can, because you got to a witness before I did, and then they had time to get their story straight. They heard your questions. When I came along, their whole story was different, or what have you. Or, your finding took 45 days, and you found him not responsible under a standard of preponderance of evidence. And now I'm doing an investigation, and I'm trying to go to a court of law where the standard is beyond a reasonable doubt, and you can bet that that defense attorney is going to come in with that finding of not responsible and say, look, the university didn't even find him responsible at 51%. Now you guys are going to find him responsible at beyond a reasonable doubt? And so, yeah, there are ways of one process interfering with the next. That's why communication between the community response, the SART team, and the campus response is so important. Okay, and so there are just a few more questions that have just been handed to me, and they're related to a number of different matters. Where does one get investigative training? So I think you're talking about the Title IX coordinator or the Student Judicial Affairs coordinator, and where they get their investigative training. And this really varies from campus to campus. There are organizations that exist that make their money on training Title IX coordinators, and training student judicial affairs coordinators, and they're good. I mean, the training is quite good training. It's pretty pricey, but most campuses put up the money to get their folks well trained specifically on sexual violence investigations. How do schools respond if the perpetrator is faculty or staff? Under Title IX, the school should respond exactly the same way, except a school that has a student judicial process rather than a Title IX process for students will have to follow a Title IX process if the accused is a faculty or staff member. So even if they have a student judicial affairs process, if the accused is a student, they will have to go through a different employee-specific process if the accused is faculty or staff. Someone said, I thought 60 days were calendar, not business days. Susanna asked that. Susanna, I thought the same thing until about 2 or 3 weeks ago when I've been doing continued reading and research on this. And the latest guidance from OCR, from the Office for Civil Rights, is that those 60 days are business days. But again, this is not anything that's been in writing. This has been through phone conversations with employees. So that is my best understanding at this time. There are also often allowances made for things like spring break and Christmas break and those types of things. And then someone wanted to know the pros and cons for the Title IX investigation being separate versus being done by campus police. The victim may not initially want police involved, but later may change their mind. And that's a really great question. I think that, you know, one of the major pros to doing it as a separate process from the police is that it can keep the criminal justice process outside of the university process, which can keep things cleaner for both. It also does not, you know, make the victim have to make a police report or, you know, work with the police. Everything that we do as advocates to try to convince our survivors, you know, the police are well trained, I can be with you. Sometimes people are still worried that things are going to get out of hand. Feel like the criminal justice process is going to move forward whether they want it to or not, and that they're going to not have a good experience working with the police. In terms of the investigation, I'm a believer that 2 heads are better than 1, so if the person does want to make a police report, I encourage the sharing of investigative findings and that sort of thing. I can see where a criminal justice process might be a little hesitant, the criminal justice investigators, to share everything that they have with the folks at the university because they're trying to build a good, strong case, and you know that might mean not having leaks in what they're trying to accomplish or show. So those are just some of the pros and cons, and I think we're going to stop there.
Yes, thank you so much, Roberta, for walking us through a pretty complicated area. I hope it was beneficial to everyone on the line. And just a reminder, you all will be receiving an evaluation when you close out of this webinar, and then also our next webinar is coming up on June 26th, and a formal invitation will be coming your way soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Please stand by.